Claude responded, "My son-in-law Marcus stood in my dining room on a Sunday afternoon in October and told me, in the calm voice of a man who has practiced a speech in his car bef. My son-in-law Marcus stood in my dining room on a Sunday afternoon in October and told me, in the calm voice of a man who has practiced a speech in his car before coming inside, that he and Renee had spoken with a lawyer and that it would be best for everyone if I signed the house over to them now, rather than waiting for it to become complicated later." He used that word twice, complicated, as if the house I had owned outright for 31 years was a math problem that needed simplifying, and he was the one qualified to simplify it. My daughter Renee sat beside him at the table where her mother and I used to eat breakfast every morning of our marriage, and she looked at her hands. She did not look at me. She had a way of going quiet that I had learned, over the 2 years since her mother died, meant she had already agreed to something, and was waiting to see how much resistance she would have to absorb before it was final. I said, "Walk me through the thinking." Marcus said they weren't trying to rush me, they just wanted to get ahead of things, make sure everything was clean before anything happened to me, and that a lawyer named Phil Ostrander could have the paperwork ready by the end of the month. I nodded. I said that made sense, that I appreciated them thinking ahead. I said I wanted to sit with it for a few days. Renee looked up then, just for a second, and something crossed her face that might have been relief, or might have been the particular shame of a person watching a plan work exactly as she'd hoped it wouldn't have to. I finished my coffee. I told them I was tired and going to bed early, and I went upstairs to the room where Carol and I had slept for 28 years, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I picked up my phone, and I called a number I had saved 11 months earlier under the name Ken Attorney, though at the time I had told myself I was probably being paranoid. He answered on the third ring. I said, "Ken, it's Walter Pruitt. I need you to start the filing tomorrow morning." There was a pause, the particular pause of a man checking a calendar he keeps current for exactly this kind of call, and he said, "I'll have it ready by 10. I set the phone down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word complicated and about the fact that Marcus and Renee had no idea that the house they were planning to simplify had stopped being simple for them 9 months earlier, in a way neither of them had noticed, because they had never once asked me what I'd done with my time since Carol passed. My name is Walter Pruitt. I am 66 years old. I live in Springfield, Missouri, in a house on Redbud Lane that I built with my own hands, starting in 1994, back when I ran a small commercial construction outfit called Pruitt and Sons, though there had only ever been me and one nephew who left the trade after 2 years to sell insurance, so the name was more hope than accuracy. I spent 39 years in construction, first as a framer, then a foreman, then the owner of a company that built strip malls and church additions, and, for one memorable stretch in the late 90s, half the medical office park off Kearney Street. I say this not because it matters what I built, but because of what it teaches you, which is that a structure only fails at the point you didn't check. You can pour a foundation perfectly and frame a house perfectly and still lose the whole thing to a header beam nobody thought to size correctly, because the failure doesn't announce itself in advance. It waits. It waits for the load. I had spent 39 years learning to find the load-bearing points before the roof came down, and when Carol died, some part of me that had been quiet during our marriage, because during our marriage there was no roof, I needed to inspect, woke back up and started walking the house, checking the joints, the way I'd walk a job site at 6 in the morning before the crew arrived. Carol Ann Pruitt, born Carol Ann Dietrich in Ozark, Missouri, in 1958, was the reason Pruitt and Sons ever became anything more than a man with a truck and a level. She kept the books for 11 years before we could afford an office manager. She remembered every client's kid's name and every subcontractor's wife's birthday, and she believed, with a conviction I never fully shared but always respected, that people generally deserve the benefit of the doubt right up until the specific moment they proved they didn't. She taught 4th grade at Delaware Elementary for 22 years. She had a rose garden along the east fence that she tended from April to October with the kind of patience I associate with people who understand that some things cannot be rushed, no matter how much you want them finished. She died in January, 2 years before the Sunday I'm describing. of a stroke that took 4 days to finish what it started. 4 days in a hospital room, where I sat and held her hand and understood, somewhere in there, that the house on Redbud Lane was about to become a structure built for two people and occupied by one, and that I did not yet know how to live inside that math. We had 2 children. My son Peter was 41, lived 2 hours away in Colombia with his wife and their boy, called me most Sundays, drove down for holidays, and for no particular reason on a handful of ordinary weekends because, as he put it once, I don't need an occasion to come see my dad. He had his mother's habit of showing up rather than explaining why he should. My daughter Renee was 37 and had married Marcus Sellers 9 years earlier, and Marcus was a man who had spent his adult life in a rotation of ventures, a food truck that lasted a summer, a marketing consultancy that consisted mostly of a LinkedIn profile, a brief and unexplained period selling something related to solar panels, none of which had failed so much as quietly stopped, the way a fire goes out when nobody adds wood rather than when someone puts it out on purpose. He was not cruel. I want to be fair about that from the start because fairness matters to me and because this is not a story about a villain, not really. He was a man who had learned, early and thoroughly, that closeness to something stable could stand in for building something of his own. And what he had been closest to for most of his adult life was me, and after Carol died, was my house. They moved into the house in March, 6 weeks after the funeral, with the explanation that Renee didn't want me alone in that house, with all those rooms and all that quiet, and that they'd just stay until I was steadier, until the arrangement stopped making sense for everybody. They had been renting a 2-bedroom in the Roundtree neighborhood since 2019, a lease I happened to know the details of because I had co-signed it, and because I had been covering $400 of the monthly rent since 2020 after Marcus's solar venture folded, a contribution Renee had called temporary, in a tone that made clear she believed it. I was in no state, in February and March of that year, to evaluate anything clearly. Grief does that. It opens the door wider than judgment would allow. And I let them in the way you let in weather, not because you invited it, but because closing the door against it seems, in the moment, like more effort than it's worth. Clarity came slowly, the way it always does, arriving as a series of small facts, rather than one large one. The first was in May, 7 weeks after they'd moved in, when I came home from the hardware store to find the dining room rearranged. Carol's china cabinet moved from the wall where she'd had it for 20 years, where the afternoon light hit the glass just right, moved to make room for a sectional Marcus had bought without asking me, in a house that was still, on the deed, entirely mine. It was a small thing. I told myself it was a small thing. The second came in July, when Marcus mentioned, apropos of a news segment about interest rates, that property values in Springfield had really come up since I bought the place, and that it was probably worth doing an appraisal sometime, just to know. He said it the way you say something you've rehearsed to sound unrehearsed. I noted it. I did not say anything. The third came in September, at dinner, when Renee mentioned that the guest room, which had been her brother Peter's room growing up, and which I used now to store Carol's sewing machine and the boxes of her classroom, things I hadn't yet been able to go through, might make more sense as a home office for Marcus, since he was between ventures again and needed, in her words, a proper space to work from. I said I liked the room the way it was. She said, "Sure, just a thought," in the tone of someone setting a thought down carefully so she could pick it back up later. The fourth came in early October, 3 weeks before the Sunday at the table, when I walked past the study, my study, the room where I keep Carol's photo albums and my own tax records and 30 years of invoices from Pruitt and Sons that I never got around to throwing out, and heard Marcus on the phone, low, using the specific vocabulary of a man describing a property to someone who might want to buy it or help him get it. Square footage, lot size. The bones are solid, the location's excellent, it's really just a matter of the paperwork. He didn't hear me in the hallway. I stood there for 11 seconds. I know it was 11 because I counted the way I count load calculations, out of habit, to keep my hands steady, and then I walked to the kitchen and got a legal pad out of the drawer where I keep the warranty cards for the appliances, and I wrote down the date and what I'd heard. And that was the first entry in what became, by the following October, a 44-page record, dated, specific, no editorializing, because editorializing is what you do when you're not sure of the facts. And I was becoming sure. I called my son Peter on a Thursday evening in late October, 7 months after Marcus and Renee had moved in, and I told him what I'd been noting. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Dad, I've noticed some of this too, from a distance." And I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was attacking my sister. I said, "I need to know what you actually think, not what's diplomatic." He said, "I think Marcus has never once in his life built something of his own, and I think Renee loves him enough that she's decided helping him get comfortable is the same thing as helping him grow up, and I don't think those are the same thing at all." I said that matched what I was seeing. He asked what I was going to do. I said I was going to talk to Ken Ostrander. Ken was the attorney who'd handled Carol's estate and the trust we'd set up together back in 2015 when we were both healthy, and neither of us thought we'd need it for another 20 years. Peter said, "Does Renee know you're even talking to a lawyer?" I said, "Not yet. Your mother would have handled the human part of this faster than I'm handling it. I get there eventually. I'm getting there now." Ken Ostrander was 61, had practiced estate and property law in Springfield for 32 years, and had the quality I valued most in the people I hired over the course of my career, which was that he didn't perform concern. He addressed problems the way a good foreman addresses a cracked slab. The crack is what it is. You don't spend 20 minutes feeling bad about it. You figure out whether it's structural, and you fix what needs fixing. I'd known him since 2015, when Carol and I updated our estate plan after her sister died young and left a mess that took the family 2 years and $40,000 in legal fees to untangle, a mess we both swore we'd never leave behind for our own kids. When I called Ken that October, I told him what I was seeing, and he asked me the same 3 questions he'd asked when Carol and I first met with him. Was there a lease between me and Marcus and Renee? Was there any rent being paid? Was there any written agreement at all about how long they'd be staying? And the answer to all 3 was no. He said, "Walter, what you've got is a tenancy at will. They're occupying your property at your discretion, which means you can end that discretion with proper notice. In Missouri, that's typically 30 days for a situation like yours, sometimes 60, depending on how the arrangement gets characterized. But the more important thing is what we do to protect the property itself, starting now, rather than waiting until there's a fight about it." I asked what he recommended. He said a revocable living trust, with me as trustee and Peter named as successor trustee, would take the house out of my individual name entirely, which meant that any future argument about what I'd promised or what was fair would run into a legal wall rather than a family argument. I asked how long it would take. He said 6 to 8 weeks for the trust documents and the deed transfer. I told him to start. The Pruitt Family Trust was established that November. The house on Redbud Lane was deeded into it in December, 4 months before the Sunday at the dining room table. Peter was named successor, trustee. Ken kept the originals in his office. I kept a copy in the fireproof box in my workshop and another copy in a safe deposit box at Guarantee Bank downtown that Marcus and Renee did not know existed because there was no reason they should have. I kept building the record through the winter and into the spring. Dated entries, small and specific, the kind of documentation you'd want if you were ever asked to prove a pattern, rather than assert one. 44 pages by the time Marcus sat down across from me on that Sunday in October and told me, with Renee beside him, looking at her hands, that they'd spoken with a lawyer of their own and that it would be best if I signed the house over to them now, before things got complicated. Ken had the notice ready by 10 the next morning, exactly as he'd promised. I was in his office on Boonville Avenue at 9:30 with the legal pad and the trust documents and a certified copy of the deed showing the Pruitt Family Trust as the record owner, and he went through everything with the specific, unhurried efficiency of a man who has been preparing for a single afternoon across 11 months and is finally getting to use the preparation. The notice was a formal 30-day notice to vacate, addressed to Marcus Allen Sellers and Renee Pruitt Sellers, tenants at will, informing them that their occupancy was terminated, effective 30 days from service, and that they were required to remove themselves and their belongings from the property by that date. Ken also drew up a second document, an accounting of the rental assistance I'd provided Marcus and Renee before they moved in the $400 a month since 2020, totaling $6,400 to have on record, in case Marcus later tried to describe our arrangement as something other than what it had actually been. I signed what needed signing. Ken said the process server would have the papers to the house by early afternoon. I drove home, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and the legal pad, and I waited. The way you wait after you've already done the actual work and there's nothing left to do, but let the consequence arrive. The server came at 1:15. I heard the knock from the kitchen, and I stayed where I was, because it wasn't my door to answer that particular afternoon. I heard Renee open it. I heard the short exchange that happens when someone hands you an envelope and tells you what it is, an exchange that doesn't take long because it doesn't require conversation, just a signature confirming you received it. I heard the door close, and then I heard the specific silence that fills a house when somebody has just read 3 sentences that rearrange everything they believed about their own life. Renee came into the kitchen at 1:19, holding the envelope like it might do something further if she held it wrong. She said, "Dad, what is this?" I said, "It's a notice to vacate. You and Marcus have 30 days to remove your things from the property." She said, "You can't do this to us." I said, "The notice is from the trustee of the Pruitt Family Trust, which has held title to this house since December. Ken Ostrander prepared and filed it this morning. I can, in fact, do exactly this." She looked at the envelope again, and then at me, and said, "What trust?" I said, "The house hasn't been in my individual name for 10 months, Renee. It's in a revocable trust with me as trustee and your brother as successor trustee, and the trust has exercised its right to end the tenancy at will arrangement you and Marcus have had here for 18 months. She said, "We've been helping you. Marcus has fixed things around here. I've been cooking. I've been doing your laundry." I said, "I want to be precise about the 18 months, since precision seems to matter to both of us right now. In that time, I've paid every utility bill in this house. I've paid the property taxes, I've replaced the water heater, and I resealed the driveway myself in June because I still know how. I also paid $400 a month toward your old apartment for most of a year before that. What I received in exchange was some help around the house and a slow rearrangement of my home into a configuration that suited the two of you rather than the one that suited your mother and me for 20 years. That isn't a help arrangement, Renee. That's a residence arrangement, and as of this morning, it's ended." Her voice went sharp then, the way it does when a person feels the ground actually move rather than just tilt. She said, "You're really going to throw your own daughter out of her home?" I said, "This was never your home. It was my home, and you and Marcus were living in it. There's a difference, and I think somewhere in the last 18 months you stopped being able to see it, which is exactly why the notice exists." She left the kitchen. I heard her go upstairs. I heard the low, fast sound of a conversation happening behind a closed door, too fast for the walls to fully catch, and I finished my coffee and refilled the cup and sat with the legal pad open to the last page, the entry from the night before. Sunday, October 19th. Marcus and Renee proposed. I signed the house over before it becomes complicated. I wrote the date, closed the notebook, and waited for Marcus. He came down about 15 minutes after Renee had gone up, holding the notice in one hand, wearing the expression of a man who has just spent a quarter hour absorbing someone else's panic without yet locating his own. He said, "Walter." I said, "Marcus." He said, "You're evicting us." I said, "The trust is ending the tenancy. I'd encourage you not to make this about yesterday specifically, because it isn't. Yesterday was the last item on a list that's 18 months long." He sat down across from me and set the notice on the table, looking at it the way you look at a document, hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something you can live with. He said, "We were trying to look out for you, get things settled before." I said, "Before what, Marcus? Before I get too old to know my own mind?" Because that's the assumption sitting underneath everything you and Renee have said to me since March, and I want you to hear it said plainly, once, in this kitchen. You didn't ask me if I wanted the house transferred. You told me it would be best. You'd already talked to a lawyer of your own before you talked to me. That's not looking out for somebody. That's managing them. He didn't answer for a while. Then he said, I know how it looks. I said, I spent 39 years in construction, Marcus. I don't argue with what the level tells me. It either reads plumb or it doesn't, and no amount of explaining changes the reading. I've got 44 pages of dated notes that are the reading on this situation, going back to a phone call I overheard you having in this house last October, describing my property to somebody like it was already yours to describe. I'm not looking for a different interpretation of that. I've got the actual one. He was quiet a long time. Then he said, Where are we supposed to go? I said, That's the first question you've asked me in 18 months that I actually respect, because it's the right one. You've got 30 days to answer it, and how you answer it is yours to decide, which is exactly how decisions about where grown adults live are supposed to work. I called Peter that evening from the back porch, standing near what used to be Carol's rose bed, cut back now for the season, the canes bare against the fence in the October light. He answered on the first ring and asked how it had gone. I told him Ken had served the notice at 1, and that I'd talked to Renee and then Marcus that afternoon. He asked if I was all right. I said I thought so, that what I was feeling wasn't anger, exactly, but something closer to the specific relief of setting down a weight you've been carrying long enough that your arms had started treating it as normal. He said, Mom would have done this faster. I said, I know. She always got to the human part of things quicker than I did. I get there, just slower. He asked about the roses. I told him I was thinking of trying the climbing variety his mother had always wanted along the back fence, the one she'd written about in her garden notebook but never gotten around to planting. We talked another 20 minutes about nothing to do with Marcus or Renee or 30-day notices, and after we hung up, I stood on the porch a while longer and watched a cardinal work. The feeder Carol had kept full for years, and that I had kept full since, because some habits are really just a way of keeping a person present in a house that no longer holds them. Marcus and Renee were gone in 24 days, 6 ahead of the deadline. I believe the acceleration had something to do with a consultation of their own, an attorney who likely told them what Ken's notice already said plainly, that the trust structure was sound, that a tenancy at will was exactly what it sounded like, and that fighting it would cost more than it would recover. Whatever the reason, 24 days after the Sunday at the table, I stood in my workshop while a rented truck idled in the driveway, and Marcus and Renee loaded the last of their boxes. I wasn't hiding from the moment. There was a bookshelf I'd promised Peter's boy for Christmas, and it needed finishing, and my standing in the driveway to watch them leave wouldn't have made anything better for anyone involved. Marcus knocked on the workshop door around 11. He came in and looked around at the tools, the way people look at a space they've walked past for years without really seeing it, and he said, I wanted to say something before we go. I said, Go ahead. He said, I think I knew this wasn't right for a while before you served the notice. I let Renee carry the plan because it was easier than being the one to stop it. I'm not proud of that. I said, That's an honest thing to say, and I'll take it as one. He said, I'm sorry, Walter. I said, I believe you are. What happens next between us is something we'll figure out as it comes. I'm not shutting a door on you. I'm shutting an arrangement that stopped being honest a long time before yesterday. He almost smiled at that and put his hand out, and I shook it, which wasn't everything, but also wasn't nothing, and was about the size of what the moment could actually hold. He walked back out front. I heard the truck doors, then the engine, then it pulling away down Redbud Lane, and I stood in the workshop a while, in the smell of sawdust, in the particular quiet of a room where I'd spent decades doing work that either held or didn't. Renee didn't call for 6 weeks. When she finally did, in early December, it was short and careful, nothing like the calls that used to come when she needed something and knew exactly which tone would get it. I don't know yet what those calls are becoming. I've decided to treat that as an open question rather than a closed one, because I'm a patient man and because Carol taught me, over 28 years, that some things you plant don't come up the first season or the second, and you keep tending them anyway. Not because you're certain they'll bloom, but because tending is the only part that was ever actually yours to control. I repainted the dining room in November, not because there was anything wrong with the paint, but because I wanted the room to feel like mine again, in every particular way a room can. I chose a soft blue, close to what Carol had picked out back in 2003. The color, she used to say, made the morning light look like it was coming through water. Peter came down the Sunday I finished it, stood in the doorway with his boy on his hip, and said, "Mom would have loved this." I told him she'd picked something close to it the first time, 20 years back. He said he knew he'd found her decorating notebook, going through her things that fall, and in it, dated 2016, an entry that read, "If Marcus ever talks your father into signing that house away, the first thing to do is repaint the dining room. It's the room that still feels like both of us." She'd known. She'd written it 8 years before any of this happened, in a spiral notebook with a coffee ring on the cover, and she'd been right about all of it. The timing, the room, what needed to come back first. I put a photograph of that page in a frame on the sideboard where a picture of Marcus and Renee's wedding used to sit, and now, most mornings, the light comes through the window the way she used to describe it, over her own handwriting, in a room that finally belongs to the people who were always meant to be in it. What I want to say, at the end of all this, is something about the nodding, and the smiling, and the walking upstairs to make the one phone call I'd been sitting on for 11 months. The decision wasn't made that Sunday. It was made the previous October, standing in a hallway, listening to a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. It was made in a lawyer's office in November, and again in December, when the deed changed hands on paper before anyone else in the family had any idea it needed to. It was made in 44 dated entries on a legal pad I kept in a kitchen drawer next to the warranty cards, one small true fact at a time. The way you build anything that's meant to carry weight later. A house doesn't fail at the moment somebody makes the mistake. It fails months or years down the line, under a load nobody accounted for, and by then, it's too late to go back and size the beam correctly. I spent 39 years learning to find the weak point before the weight arrived. I found it in my own family in about a year, and I corrected it the same way I would have corrected it on a job site quietly, before anyone upstairs even knew there was a problem to fix. The house is still standing. The dining room is blue again. And most mornings, if you're up early enough, there's a cardinal at the feeder my wife kept full for 20 years, and I keep full still, because that's the part of the structure I was never trying to protect for myself. That was always hers. Claude responded, "Some of the strongest protection we ever build isn't loud. It's a quiet notebook, a patient phone call, a room kept ready for someone who's gone. Some of the strongest protection we ever build isn't loud. It's a quiet notebook, a patient phone call, a room kept ready for someone who's gone." Walter didn't win by shouting. He won by paying attention, season after season, the way you'd tend a rose bed you're not even sure will bloom. Love the people in your life generously, but keep your eyes open too. Devotion and awareness were never opposites, and both are how we keep the people and the homes we cherish. A small note for you. This story was written and imagined by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lesson still found its way into your heart.